Andy, we're here again to cram for the exam. Today's topic may be our most important, the president.
Yeah, Article 2, the executive branch. Remember, this is a part of government that was left out of the Articles of Confederation, not wanting to put too much power in one person. But in our U.S. Constitution, the president is a major player.
Well, Andy, the formal powers given to our president aren't very impressive. Most of the powers the president has, if you were to just read the Constitution, he shares with the other branches, particularly the Congress. Andy, if the formal powers aren't that impressive, why is our president today incredibly impressive?
Well, the reality is that the size of the federal government has grown immensely through the Great Depression, through the Cold War. And because the president is the chief executive, because he has the power to direct the federal bureaucracies to enforce the law, as those bureaucracies get bigger and bigger, that one person as chief executive has even more power.
Let's not forget wars as well, Andy, have aggrandized presidential power. Many of those formal powers in the Constitution speak to military powers. The president's the commander-in-chief. He can appoint ambassadors, make treaties, of course with Senate help on all those. But Andy, the war powers have made our president increasingly powerful because even the founders wanted that energetic president to make those quick, important decisions, and only the president, the one man, can do that.
As commander-in-chief, he can do that. We know that there are current laws passed after Vietnam where Congress asks the president to notify them and to get congressional approval. That's called the War Powers Resolution. But that only applies when ground troops are involved. So when you have actions like missile strikes or airstrikes, the president as commander-in-chief has tremendous military powers.
Andy, there are other powers that have increased president's stature around the world, and some of these are not in the Constitution. They've just been based on tradition, like executive orders and executive agreements. In both cases, executive orders allowing the president to make a decree and implement some sort of domestic policy, or an executive agreement, equally a decree but with a foreign country. Andy, in both cases, they have the rule of law but do not require congressional support.
That's right. So even though our Constitution calls for checks and balances, things like the House being able to impeach the president and the Senate being able to convict him in an impeachment trial, the president has tremendous latitude with some of those vague powers.
You know, another power that the president has that the Constitution doesn't mention is executive privilege. Here again, based on the tradition of the office and sustained by the Supreme Court in its decisions, executive privilege at a time when we want more and more transparency, executive privilege allows the president to be somewhat secretive. And the argument, of course, is unless he has that confidential contact with his advisors, they won't give him the best advice. Andy, this makes for a more secretive presidency.
That's right. In the case of U.S. v. Nixon, we saw the Supreme Court say that executive privilege is an absolute, that at some points the executive branch has to hand that information over to Congress. But we also know presidents still use executive privilege quite a bit to keep their confidential discussions confidential.
Let's talk about one more area where the president is extremely powerful. And you mentioned the bureaucracy, but let's face it, the cabinet itself is not very powerful. The executive agencies isn't where the power of the federal government lies. Andy, more and more it lies in that White House office staff, which are not confirmed by the Senate. This is the president's most loyal and most faithful servants, mind you, and many times we don't even know who they are.
That's right. And this includes the chief of staff, the people who direct the White House office, and it's now thousands of employees who work directly for the president, and in many ways they are more loyal and more directly compliant to what the president requests than members of the cabinet or the deputy secretaries from whatnot.
Say we're talking about presidential power, but Andy, there's a question out there we heard from one of our listeners, and they're still a little confused about the Electoral College. Briefly, let's just talk about how that works and why we still have it.
Well, the Electoral College is an indirect way of electing our president. Back when they first came up with the office of the president, they were very concerned about giving the people too much power in selecting the president. So we came up with an Electoral College where electors actually cast the official vote for president. These days, it takes 270 electoral votes from these electors to get officially elected as president.
Each state receives the total number of electors of their representation in Congress. So let's say if Illinois had 19 representatives in the House, 2 senators, Illinois gets 21 electoral votes. And the key word, Andy, when you look at the Electoral College is winner take all. Whichever presidential candidate receives the most votes in a particular state, they receive all of that state's electoral votes. Andy, 270 wins it out of a total of 538 electoral votes. Andy, we're looking at presidential power. When you look at the Constitution, not very impressive. But looking at today's president, I would say impressive. What's going on inside the news? We know we're 2 teachers. No fancy words.
No fancy suits.
Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.